Another F1 weekend, another qualifying crash, and Sergio Perez has just one more race to convince Red Bull not to drop him mid-season ahead of critical talks in the summer break. Red Bull's points lead was slashed by McLaren in the Hungarian Grand Prix, and its need to close out the Constructors' Championship in particular is why a drastic driver change is being so seriously considered for the rest of 2024. Nothing is being decided before the August break, so Perez does still have the Belgian Grand Prix to build on the shoots of recovery seen in Hungary. Perez produced what Red Bull feels was his best race performance in 3 months to recover from 16th to 7th, but the fact he needed to recover at all means his team bosses are still far from convinced that he can be the reliable driver they need to win both titles this season. That's why Red Bull has been drawing up contingency plans for the rest of this year and for 2025, and that really could mean dropping Perez, with Daniel Ricciardo emerging as the leading candidate to replace him. Even though Perez recently signed a new contract keeping him at the team until the end of 2026, that always had performance clauses to meet and the potential to be bought out. The situation is extremely fluid, partly because Red Bull has multiple drivers it could replace Perez with, even if none of them are stunningly convincing in the circumstances, and it's been trying to deal with this situation while coming under more pressure on track. That's left Red Bull working through its driver options on the fly, with team boss Christian Horner and motorsport advisor Helmut Marko having different preferences, meaning one week it's Liam Lawson being talked up, the next it's Yuki Tsunoda, and most recently it's Ricciardo. That's why Red Bull wants to get to the break with data from the last Grand Prix of the first part of the season to make a decision free from the rapidly changing variables of a race weekend. That means one more race for the drivers currently on the grid to stake their respective claims. Ricciardo is essentially in an all-or-nothing position. He could be in the Red Bull after the summer break, or may lose his RB seat for 2025. How quickly Red Bull's considerations are changing was actually hinted at indirectly by Ricciardo in Hungary, as he was even talking in terms of trying to save his RB seat, let alone gun for Perez's. Ricciardo said he'd not been told anything by Red Bull, although it is believed a few races ago he'd been given the summer break as a deadline to make the strongest case he could. What he probably didn't know, as he alluded to, is whether he was trying to save his skin for 2025 or trying to make himself a candidate to replace Perez. We have to admit a Red Bull seat for Ricciardo seemed so unlikely until very recently because he'd largely unimpressed this year alongside Yuki Tsunoda in the second Red Bull team. But the reason Ricciardo's now being seriously considered for the top team again is because of the general trend of the last few events and a feeling that he is actually the most dependable short-term option. Ricciardo has compared well to Tsunoda from the Canadian Grand Prix onwards, scoring 6 points to Tsunoda's 3, and felt poor strategy cost him another chance to score in Hungary. This hasn't been a stunning turnaround, but it has helped give Red Bull bosses more faith in him, and crucially, it's coincided with Red Bull's championship reality becoming crystal clear. Perez has scored just 21 points in the last 7 events, and Red Bull's been fortunate not to have come under more championship pressure as Ferrari's faltered, and McLaren is still battling back from a slow-ish start to the season. But McLaren just outscored Red Bull big time with its 1-2 in Hungary, and that's rammed home how quickly Red Bull could be caught if it continues to only have one car scoring good points or any points at all. It's reiterated the need for a dependable second driver, as winning the Constructors' Championship is a huge priority for Red Bull. It's of massive importance to the team, and one factor even being considered is that it's the difference of thousands of pounds in bonuses for each team member. That's where the preference for Ricciardo comes from. He's an experienced driver, so should handle the high pressure situation well. And he's performing at a good level again, so can support Verstappen effectively, especially as the RB20 should be compatible enough with his driving style to get the best out of him. Liam Lawson recently drove Red Bull's 2024 car in a short test at Silverstone in between the British and Hungarian Grand Prix. His first run in the RB20 was facilitated by a filming day that limits teams to 200 km of running and the use of special Pirelli Academy tyres that aren't on the same level as F1 race tyres. Nonetheless, we understand Red Bull had a reference lap time from Verstappen for Lawson to be compared against, and that Lawson's pace was in the window the team needed it to be. This basically means within a few tenths of Verstappen, which is where Perez was at for the first quarter of the season when he was regularly scoring podiums. It was initially thought after this test that Lawson had put himself in a great position to be promoted in place of Perez after the summer break, especially as Red Bull needs to secure a race seat for Lawson by September, even if it is for 2025, or he becomes a free agent. The intention would be for Lawson to improve as he builds experience and confidence, but score points at a good rate from the start, even if he is near or right at the back of the lead group of 8 cars. After all, that is the best Perez has offered over the last 7 races, and he even failed to score points in 3 of them. But things have changed the more the situation has been considered. While Lawson is regarded as a driver of high potential, one argument against putting him in the car for the rest of 2024 is how much that would ask of a young driver who has been on the sidelines this year. The high stakes that are putting Perez on the brink mid-season also mean handing his seat to a wildcard choice would be very risky. Getting close to Verstappen is no easy task, even for an experienced driver with good knowledge of all the tracks and familiarity with the car itself. Lawson has none of that in his favour. Some feedback within Red Bull is that Lawson's pace and self-confidence would at least protect him from suffering the same fate as Perez's predecessors Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon. But Red Bull doesn't need a young driver with a high ceiling in the short term. It needs a consistent option for the final 10 races after the break who can help get the title over the line. And if it turns to Ricciardo to offer that, Lawson could take his seat at RB so Red Bull can re-evaluate him alongside Tsunoda in that environment over half a season. Lawson would then be in contention to take the Red Bull racing drive full-time in 2025 if he impressed and if Ricciardo struggled. Or he could continue for a full season at RB if Ricciardo performs strongly enough alongside Verstappen to earn an extended stay. Yuki Tsunoda has largely outperformed Ricciardo at RB this season, even though the battles gradually become more even, but he isn't in line for an immediate promotion. Like Lawson, he has been recently tipped as a contender for Perez's seat in 2025. It's thought that Tsunoda is Red Bull Motorsport advisor Helmut Marko's favoured pick and that Marko would do that mid-season if it was down to him. Previously, it was. Many a Red Bull driver career has lived and died on the old Austrian's whim. But the internal fight for control at Red Bull over the last year or more has resulted in power shifting towards Horner when it comes to driver choice, even though Marko remains in charge of the junior program itself. The doubts over Tsunoda seem to be off-track issues, given his performances on it are more consistent than ever. And he has often been a strong leader for RB when Ricciardo, the more experienced driver, should really be showing him the way. Tsunoda's attitude, his approach, and his capacity to deal with the pressure of being in a top team alongside Verstappen are all unofficially cited by Red Bull insiders as reasons why he's being overlooked. There was even a crude and slightly unfair suggestion that anything Tsunoda helps win the team financially by finishing first in the Constructors' Championship would be offset by crash damage. Rightly or wrongly, that is unfortunately the reality that Tsunoda seems to face. At the very least, there's significant enough reservations from the management of the team to make a Tsunoda promotion a definite long shot. He will almost certainly only be Verstappen's teammate in the unlikely event that Perez is dropped, Ricciardo's a terrible replacement, and Lawson absolutely bombs wherever he slots in. So maybe as a last resort, Tsunoda would get a chance. Otherwise, he does seem to be heading for a frustrating rejection. To even be behind Lawson in the pecking order is something he doesn't understand at all. When we asked Tsunoda in Hungary if he would find it weird to be overlooked for a less experienced driver like Lawson if there is a vacancy at the senior team, Tsunoda bluntly agreed it would be exactly that. Let's get back to Perez. The easiest outcome for Red Bull, and the one it has lived in desperate hope of, is that he gets back to regularly scoring podiums. But now we're one race away from the summer break that the decision will be made in, the best Perez can do is get back on the podium, so there's at least one race since April where he scored a proper Red Bull driver's result. For many races, that's not looked like it will happen at all. But in Hungary, either side of a heavy crash and Q1 elimination, there were signs of a very real improvement that might help save Perez from the brink. Perez called Friday practice in Hungary the most comfortable I've felt with the car at this stage of the weekend in a while, having been 2 tenths slower than Verstappen despite missing a new bodywork package tailor-made for the high downforce Hungaroring. But Perez did at least have some other upgrades on his car, most beneficial being the new front wing and resulting stronger front end, boosting his confidence and feel. The bad news for Perez is he couldn't translate this into anything in qualifying as he shunted in Q1 after taking a little too much of the damp entry curb into turn 8. The good news is he atoned for this with a genuinely good drive on Sunday, rising to 7th and beating his fellow surprise Q1 Exeter George Russell in his Mercedes along the way. Perez's pace in the race was also, for large spells, very close to Verstappen's. That performance seemed to be born from a genuine improvement in Perez's comfort and speed. This meant he had a confidence about him in Hungary in and out of the car that frankly had been missing for too long. Even after he'd shunted, he was surprisingly calm and upbeat, which compared starkly to similar moments in recent races where he seemed lost. Horner called it Perez's best race since his last podium finish in China 3 months ago, but declined to answer directly when we asked him if Perez would keep his drive by repeating this quality of performance at Spa. Instead, Horner only said he hoped Perez would take confidence from the weekend. A repeat at Spa does feel critical, without the qualifying crash obviously, if there is to be a late turnaround in this narrative. As the incumbent driver, Perez has always had control of his destiny. Lately that's not felt like the case, but there is a glimmer of hope for him going to Belgium. Though a decision of this magnitude should never come down to a single Grand Prix, the stakes are sky high heading into this one.